on, everyone? Welcome back to Critical Conversations. My name is Sam Castles. My co-host
is Jared Bessie.
Good save, Jared.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the first episode that's not the introduction. So in a way, it's episode 2, but in a way, it's episode 1.
It's the repilot, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we are going to be talking about the economy today and why people have a partisan view of the economy. And I think Jared can introduce that a little more. But before he jumps into that, just going to kind of readdress what we're about here. So we talked about this in the intro, but Jared and I are seeking to kind of cut through the noise of the political divide today. And it's easy to sit down and listen to the side that you agree with or the sites that you like. And there's just a lot of shouting down the other side. So we're trying to sift through issues, topics, news, think critically, be humble, be open-minded, and be dismissive of nothing. So it's going to be a good episode. I'm excited to learn more. I had not thought a lot about this before Jared brought it up. So do you want to talk a little bit about this topic for today and what made you pick it?
Yeah, so this week we're going to talk about a little bit of the partisan economy and basically what's going on and how we view the economy, specifically in 2020. So what kind of brought this to my attention is an article by 538. This is one of Sam and I's favorite sites. They do a lot of really good work. And they basically talked about how in 2008, the U.S. was in a recession, and everyone pretty much agreed that the economy was really bad and that we were all going through a recession. And now here we are in 2020, just coming through COVID. The economy doesn't look great. The stock market's doing okay, but the economy itself isn't great. But Americans have wildly different views on what that actually means and whether the economy is actually good or bad. So that just was like, whoa, okay, so what does that mean? I think it fits our thesis of the show is like, okay, if two different people are saying these different things, what is the truth? What are we actually feeling about this? And why the heck are we talking about this through partisan lens when something as simple as the economy is seemingly so basic?
Right. It should be objective, right? Or at least it's presented that way a lot of times.
And I think this will be a good stepping stone to other topics because obviously partisanship influences so much. And there's a lot of what we're going to be talking about on this show. And so I think talking about like after COVID, all this stuff really hits home for today. So, but before we get into that and get too deep into that, Sam's got a couple of different news stories from this week that we're just going to talk about.
Yeah. So we've talked about doing like a quick news flash before each topic to kind of keep in the know, talk about some interesting ideas, maybe some topics for down the road. But it's good to stay informed and be critical. So we got a few things we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to talk about our first piece today. All right. So this recently came out. Let me put it on here. So this decision came out today. We have the Justice Department accusing Yale of discriminating against white and Asian applicants. So this is an article from The Hill, but you can read basically the same story from anywhere. It's all coming from the same letter that the Department of Justice sent. So you can see it right here. Whoops, it sort of highlighted everything. Department of Justice sent a letter saying that Yale's oversized use of race favors some applicants because of their race and correspondingly disfavors other applicants because of their race, with most Asian American and white applicants unduly bearing the brunt of the preferences Yale grants to its racially preferred applicants.
Yeah, so, I read that, or like, so as not hearing this story before just now, like I read that and growing up in a conservative place, like that's something that was always talked about as like, oh, these, elite schools are discriminating against blah, 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 specifically white people often because that's the culture I grew up in. And then it's interesting to actually see that the DOJ has found evidence of that. So that just strikes me as really interesting.
Yeah. So, this has been going on for 2 years. This investigation started 2 years ago. And like Jared said, this has sort of been a bit of a hot topic throughout the years. Yeah. It's really fascinating. I did a little bit of digging back through sort of the history of this debate. And basically, at least from my eyes, like, it's really interesting to see the government sort of introduce and implement this idea of affirmative action. So if you don't know what affirmative action is, I'll do a little quick tab over. Oh wait, this is the wrong one. I gotta learn these hotkeys, man. Control tab. Okay, so I'm gonna pop over to affirmative action. So this is just Wikipedia's definition, but basically, if you don't know what affirmative action is, it's basically a set of laws, policies, and guidelines and administrative practices intended to end and correct the effects of a specific form of discrimination. So, like it says in the next sentence there, these programs tend to focus on access to education and employment, granting special consideration to historically excluded groups, specifically racial minorities or women. So, affirmative action really has a long history. You can kind of see, if you want to read more of the...
It's a very loaded term, too. You hear affirmative, and you're like, you either have like a or you have like a, oh yeah, this is good. It's this kind of loaded topic.
Right. And yeah, long history. If you see it like dating back to way back in the Roosevelt administration, and almost every administration has touched it in some way. There's been Supreme Court case after Supreme Court case. There's been implementations in universities, hiring practices, especially in government agencies, and so many things. So it's really fascinating, I think, to see the way the government has encouraged it, and then you see a lot of schools. I mean, most schools end up having record the race breakdown of their student body, and then the idea is you're more likely to be picked for a scholarship if you're a minority student or a woman.
Federal funding and a lot of the kind of like FAFSA stuff comes from making sure that these schools are meeting these certain requirements.
Right.
Not just about affirmative action, but all sorts of things the government wants.
Yeah, exactly. So they've gone through kind of this weird, crazy history of like, well, you can't do quotas because that's a little too on the nose. Like, we don't want to have X amount of numbers, but the Supreme Court has always kind of been like, you should have a goal, but not a quota, which is, I don't know, it's like wild. There was these two cases that went back to back. I think here's one here, Greta versus Bollinger, and there was one right before it. Whoops, I did not mean to click on that. Yeah, Gratz versus Bollinger, a separate case decided on the same day. So on the same day, this case, Greta versus Bollinger, let's see. The court held that a student admissions process that favors underrepresented minority groups does not violate so long as it takes into account other factors. And then Gretz versus Bollinger on the same day decided the court struck down a position, what does that say? Points-based admission system that awarded automatic bonus to the admission scores of minority applicants. So same day, 1 for, 1 against, and the basic idea was you can do it, but it has to be general. Like, it can't be a quota or like you get this much boost for being a race. Like, very bizarre.
Yeah, that's a classic Supreme Court move, though. Lumping these different cases together and sending conflicting messages.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I sort of feel for Yale because I'm like, well, they're just doing kind of what they've been told. It's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Right.
But yeah, the idea is there's a lot of money tied up into making sure you can prove that you're not discriminating. My college in particular, Hillsdale College, ended up going kind of tagging along on a Supreme Court case with Grove City College that basically the court said if any of your students are taking any federal money, whether it's like a Pell Grant or whatever, FAFSA, any need-based aid, then your school has to report its race statistics. And schools like Hillsdale and Grove City have always had not done that since the founding. not necessarily in an effort to, I mean, not at all in an effort to discriminate and like only allow white students or whatever, but their idea was we don't discriminate based on race, sort of in the way we see Supreme Court talk about, like, we're not going to have a quota or like try to hit a certain number. We're instead just going to give need-based aid based on the financial status of students and not consider race or gender at all.
Right.
Anyway, I'm
trying to
going
keep
on
the government out of the college admission process as much as possible.
Right, right, exactly. So there's a lot that goes into it. Really interesting. We're gonna have to see how it goes. Basically, the the Department of Justice, go back to the Hill article, basically told them right here, it's threatened to file a civil rights lawsuit against the school if it refused to change its admission practices.
Yeah, you can.
And go ahead.
See, just like when you're talking, like you said earlier, yeah, like they're screwed either way because I've been trying to do this thing to appease the government, and now it's like they're getting sued by the government.
Yep. Yeah, I had a economics professor who sort of made the same joke about like antitrust laws, and this is like a different thing, but like the government, right. If you're charging price too high, the government can accuse you of price gouging in like an antitrust case. But if you're too low, it can accuse you of undercutting and like predatory pricing and trying to drive people out. And if you go the same, they can say, oh, you're colluding and forming a cartel trying to get like other competition out. So it's like this, it's a sort of mess. It's definitely more complicated than that. And the government definitely tries to like see each case on its own. But basically the point I'm getting at is, yeah, it's tough. I'm interested to see how it's going to shake out. Like, obviously, this is a Trump administration Department of Justice. We could see this go to the Supreme Court because if you see right here, Yale denied the allegations and said it would refuse to alter its admissions process, escalating the likelihood of a high-profile court battle.
Right, and that's how these kind of cases get started. You know, big names on either side. Like, the Supreme Court's going to take a notice.
Absolutely. And almost every school is taking the federal money and reporting race statistics. So this would be a huge case. I think it would be a whole nother episode to get into the weeds on like, oh, is affirmative action good or bad? But I just wanted to point out that this happened today. And it's just another chink in the long chain of government agencies and courts waffling back and forth on this decision. And it seems like a classic case of trying to please everybody.
Which, who knows, this could go away in November, depending on, or January, depending on November. You never know.
Absolutely. So I think that's basically it for that first case, first news report. The other thing we have is the Belarus protest going on right now.
Yeah.
So if you don't know, I'm actually going to pull up a little map of Belarus. I did not know where it was. Not going to lie. So Belarus is in Europe. Woo! Sort of.
It is right in the middle, on the eastern side.
Yeah, totally landlocked. I think they speak either Russian or Ukrainian.
Yeah, it's actually the closest country to Moscow, which is interesting.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But yeah, nestled in between Ukraine and Lithuania.
Yep. So basically, in Belarus, they just had it looks like it's been 6 days ago, they had a re-election for the longtime president, Alexander Lukashenko, who has been president of Belarus since 1994. And like I said, I just kind of learned about this. I don't know everything into the history of Belarus, but basically they have had a lot of evidence or just like signs pointing towards election intervention. And I guess the guy who was set to run against Lukashenko, where's his name? I feel like I'm mixing up my articles a little bit here, but basically there was a gentleman that was set to run against him who was pretty popular. He was not allowed to run. I can't find the tab.
But yeah, lots of election muddling, it sounds like.
Whoops, I got a tab playing audio. Yeah, so there's been these huge riots because the election came back in a landslide for Lukashenko. People are doubting that that's the case. And then on top of that, the protests, there's been thousands of protesters have been jailed and beaten. And yeah, it's really heating up. And the sort of close for the story is Mike Pompeo, who is the U.S. Secretary of State. Let's see. Sorry, Jared. I thought I had more.
You're good.
I read too many of these things. That's
Alexander why we're learning.
Yep, exactly. What? Where's Pompeo? Oh, I guess this article does not talk about it. But basically,
CNN's article.
Yeah, but basically, Mike Pompeo, who's the U.S. Secretary of State, came forward and said that they're watching the situation. The U.S. is on the side of the protesters, doesn't believe that Lukashenko should be treating the protesters this way, and I think there's going to be some U.S. action, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. That could potentially turn into something pretty big. The Hill article. Go ahead.
No, I think it's just interesting. Like, you don't hear much about these countries, and you just kind of assume you kind of assume this kind of thing to happen in South or Central America, but like, oh, this is happening, right in between Poland and Russia. Like, I don't know, really interesting.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So
it's going to be interesting. Yeah.
Bringing that up.
That is the news. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Yeah, crazy. Definitely thankful for being in America.
Yes, the free elections we have here is pretty great.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, we'll jump into our main topic for the week. I'll just like to start by I'll share my screen and I'll show this 538 article just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what kind of sparked my interest in this topic. But yeah, this is kind of what I said earlier, right? So in 2008, everyone thought the recession was bad, but in 2020, many Americans' view depends on their party. So this article is clear, like, that the economy is awful, like we're not doing well. But when it comes to the actual population and how we feel about the economy, it's vastly different. So you can see Republicans at the beginning, early 2017, it pretty much shifted as the Republican Party took office and took power, and the views have been incredibly high throughout the Trump presidency from Republicans' view, and it's getting lower and lower for the Democrats' view. Even though the economy was doing really great during that time, it was still falling among the Democrats, and now it's kind of switched that now that the economy is doing poorly, like pretty much all Democrats think it is, but Republicans have jumped back up to think the economy is doing better, even though we haven't seen signs of that really. But anyway, it's just really interesting. And yeah, like, this isn't to say that we haven't seen eye to eye on this in the past, but this right now during COVID is just an interesting dichotomy of like seeing that something that's pretty objective has different implications.
Right.
So kind of one of the things we want to do is, like, when we're talking about these terms and these topics, is kind of define our terms and stuff. So we want to kind of share what we feel like the economy is, or how we're going to talk about today what the measure of the economy is. So Sam, you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about how you might think the economy is like this objective measure. It should have, in theory, like straight ways to define, okay, economy's doing well, economy's doing poorly, but yet we see this like vast disagreement on, like Jared said, partisan views. So why are the Republicans so much more likely to say, oh, the economy's doing great, when the Democrats are saying it's doing poor. So the way that, and we can look at there's a couple other polls that sort of back up the same dichotomy.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to share the
Yeah, I can
research
share.
one or the Gallup one while I'm kind of talking about it, but yeah, this is a phenomenon that has been going on for a long time. You can see like
Right. This Pew article goes back to 2000.
Right. So you can
And
see.
yeah, depending on who's in power, like when Bush was in power, it was clearly a very stark difference. And then 2008, everyone thought it was poor.
Right.
But as we rose at the end of the Obama presidency, it was pretty positive among the Democrats. And then as soon as Trump takes office, boom, we have a huge skyrocket in how well the economy is doing.
So can you flip back to the beginning of the 538 article?
Yeah.
So if you scroll up, you can see the writers of this article, sorry, a little bit further.
Very good.
So like that first paragraph, they talk about objectively awful. So it talks about the unemployment rate, and that is definitely a great measure of what the economy is, and as well as the GDP is the other thing they say. So gross domestic product, it's been a while since I've like looked at the definition of that, but it's basically like the value of all things manufactured and sold in that year. So it's sort of just a basic indication of like, okay, well, for a really rough example, in 2008, maybe we sold 20,000 TVs or 20 million, but next year it was only 15 million. So that would be like a contraction in the GDP, and gross would be like all goods. So those should probably be the most objective two criteria for what the economy is.
Right, and even among those terms, right, there's some controversy, or there's like differences in how people like to talk about them. You know, I've read a lot when we were talking about how the unemployment rate was the lowest it had ever been, you know, early 2020, late 2019, that there was a lot of like, well, it doesn't track the amount of people that are actually looking for a job. So is the unemployment rate actually as good as it is saying it is? And then I've heard, you know, the other side, it's like, well, people are working and they're contributing to the economy still, so the unemployment rate doesn't necessarily mean everything.
Right. Yeah, there are similar critiques for GDP where you're talking about like, well, how about the quality of the goods? And I think there's more to it than that, but sometimes you'll have things that get counted in one year that end up like being important for next year, and it's very complicated. But the idea, I think, is still fair to say, okay, if you have a big contraction by unemployment in any means, and a big contraction in GDP, it's pretty fair to say the economy is doing poorly.
Right.
Even though like those measures might lack a little nuance every now and then. But it makes me wonder, Jared, well, I guess before we get into that, we might want to talk about partisan. Basically just means viewing things through a political ideology, right? So
we're looking, you know, it's if you take a singular idea and then you filter it through your partisan lens, or like using, you know, partisan terms, it's just looking at it through view of your party. So looking at the economy, you're looking at it through the view of whichever party you self-identify with.
Right. Or if you have an issue and then people are sort of split 50-50, but then you look at the political parties and it's sort of mixed, you would call this like a nonpartisan issue, or everyone agrees it's nonpartisan, everyone disagrees nonpartisan. But if you take an issue and it seems like there's this heavy correlation between what political party you support, and that's a partisan issue. So
so we take a look at like you know, something very what's something very like typical partisan issue.
Yeah, I mean, you have like immigration.
Yeah, there's a whole different outcome, or different options to get a certain outcome that the government is in charge of. So you're filtering it through your partisan lens. You're like looking at this from a partisan angle. But when you talk about the economy, it feels like to me, when I think about the economy, that's a very non-partisan issue. Obviously, there are ways to affect the economy that are very partisan. How you
Right.
approach, different things in the economy and the laws you implement, those can be very partisan. But the outcome of the economy, how the economy is doing, how it's performing, it should be a very non-partisan issue.
Right.
But instead, more and more we're seeing that's not the case.
Got it. Perfect. So what we sort of try to do here on the show is let's look at a few multiple interpretations. What are some reasons that this partisan view seems so prevalent? We saw in the Pew Research that this has sort of been a historical thing. It's definitely a recent thing.
Right.
We can talk about a few takes on why it might be what it is.
Yeah, I think throughout the history of America, this isn't some. When a civilization becomes very self-aware, as we have become, we're going to talk about these issues more and more in the broader public. So, the public is going to have its opinion on how the economy is doing because we have room to think about these things, right? And so I think in the last 20-ish years, with the influx of the internet, all these things, it's easy to talk about, and it's easy to look at, and easy to measure. And with the increase in partisanship and the increase of people looking at things in all of aspects of their life through the lens of their party, I think we have seen the increase in that. And so, so that Pew article, looks like back in 2000, everything was we were all pretty equal in how we felt about the economy.
Right.
And then we slowly tracked down as we got into after 9/11 and invasion of Iraq. That was definitely took a hit. But then that's when we kind of start seeing a big divide in the perceptions of the economy.
Yeah. So your sort of thesis for this first explanation is, well, the world is just getting more partisan, and we're just starting to see that trickle over into issues that it probably shouldn't.
Right.
Is that kind of your first take?
Yeah, but yeah, it's every I heard someone say when you're meeting a new person for the very first time, there are lots of questions you can get to know a person on different ways, but one of the best ways is ask what party they're affiliated with, and you automatically know so much else about that person, right? If you say you're Republican, you can assume all of these different things, whether they're true or not. You can assume that, and I think that's just indicative of this idea of our broader culture that we've just started thinking about everything in those terms.
Yeah.
And I think has now started to infect the economy. And I don't know if that's a new thing in particular, but
yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of go back further and see.
Right, and yeah, for sure, that's definitely something that can do more research on. What did this look like, during World War II, during the 1950s,
Sure, yeah.
even reaching back to the 20s. Yeah, that could be really interesting to see what the population thought. But again, I think that was something that was less on the average public's conscience. But I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure.
No, yeah, I definitely think there's something to that. Have you ever looked at this is 538 again. I think we're going to talk about them a lot today, but the presidential approval ratings where it compares all of the presidents throughout. I think I'll pull up. Let me see if I can get it. Oh, that's the wrong one. I'll share screen in a second, but basically, if you look back, okay, here it is. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this, I think, kind of speaks to your point. Basically, if we look at, here you go. If you look at Donald Trump's approval rating, it definitely has its ups and downs, but it's obviously pretty partisan. You can kind of assume the disapprovals are the Democrats and the approvals are the Republicans.
Right.
It looks like there's some people that probably wax and wane a little bit, but that to me,
and depending on the issue of the day,
yeah, I'm sure if you correlated this with what party are you, the correlation would be almost exactly correct.
Right.
I doubt there's very many Republicans that disapprove while you have Democrats who are approving. But if you look back through the years, you can see this partisanship kind of existed with Obama. You see George Bush a little bit more up and down. Bill Clinton maybe a little more up and down. H.W. more up and down. Pretty similar with Reagan. But I think the further back you go, you see a lot more up and down, a lot crazier. So that might be, go ahead.
And you can see like, it's all up. It like changes so much. Whereas the Trump has stayed consistently. It doesn't matter really what's going on in the day or what the president said. It's like fairly consistent of like, I like this guy or I don't like this guy, which is something new for the Trump presidency, especially when you compare like someone like W. Bush, where like after 9/11, like his approval rating soars, right? It's 95% or whatever it is. But we obviously didn't see that with COVID or any other crisis that America's gone through in the last 3 years.
Right. Yeah, because you would assume that this is like a president approval rating. It should be even more partisan. But if this is like more volatile than the economy, which obviously should potentially be a little bit less partisan because it's literally a little bit less to do with the party itself, it stands to reason that the economy should be more volatile than this. So, yeah, wild. I think another interesting idea about maybe why we're seeing such a difference could be talking about sort of the optimism of the party. So like, I know these questions are talking, I think the Gallup poll, how did it phrase it? Gallup and Pew Research, I think they showed us. But basically, it's pretty obvious that they're getting at how well is the economy doing now and not how well do you think it's going to do? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like there's a little bit of a different idea. If you ask me how strong is the economy right now, pretty much objectively, I should say like, okay, well, it's definitely not that strong. Like we just had coronavirus. We had
entering a recession, unemployment.
Yeah, huge contraction. High. Right. But if you're asking me how do I think it's going to do, I could definitely see that being more political because like if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to be like, well, it's going to get worse. President Trump's doing a terrible job. You know, the Democrat.
Right, the coronavirus response hasn't been good. He hasn't influenced the economy enough. Yeah.
Exactly. And then if I'm a Republican, I'm going to be way more optimistic because I'm like, oh, Trump is doing a good job. He is making sure things stay open, which makes me optimistic because that's what I believe, whatever.
Right.
So I'm wondering a little bit, this is my theory, that maybe people are sort of answering this question.
Are they conflating those two answers? And
yeah, I don't think anyone, if you sit down and ask them like directly, like, okay, not talking about how you think it's headed, like, do you think the economy is bad? I don't think anyone could look at unemployment numbers and contraction GDP and say like, that's good. Like clearly that's not the case. So either they're uninformed, which is a really very likely just like they don't know the numbers. They just have a feeling that it's good.
Right.
So it's probably partially that, I think, and it's probably partially people are letting their own optimism or pessimism conflate with what the objective standard is. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Right. And I think this kind of circles back to kind of my theory of the culture at large thinking they have, like every person now feels almost obligated or has an answer to everything, right? They have an opinion on things.
Right.
And I mean, I think we're guilty of the same thing. And so when you ask, you know, whoever how the economy is doing, they're going to use what they think and what they hear to influence that, not what they've actually read about the economy or like what they've looked at the economy or, you know. So I think that matters too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it also matters when you think about it from a partisan lens. This is getting a little off topic, but when you look at the demographics that support the certain parties, I think that gets into a divide too, right? So if you look at affluent white voters, evangelicals who support Trump, right now they're the least in America. They're hit the least in the coronavirus, right? It's these, it's the smaller populations. It's the people that are working minimum wage jobs that got laid off. You know, people in movie theaters and restaurants that got hit the worst. like
Right.
these kind of places, that's going to affect them more. And so that also influences the outcome of how they think the economy is doing. So, someone like middle-aged man working in the suburbs is like, hasn't lost his job. So he's like, the economy is still doing good. I still got a job.
Yep.
Whereas someone who, lost their job that's going to cause a different answer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I definitely think, like through history of presidents, it's definitely true that if the economy is doing well under an incumbent, he's more likely to get reelected, right?
Right.
So
yeah, I think that's the next kind of big meat to this, right?
Right. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's really interesting to me because a lot of times, this COVID thing it's obviously a bit of an anomaly as far as recessions go, because it sort of was unavoidable in a lot of ways. But in the past, we've seen we have this sort of cyclical bear and what's the other one? I'm drawing a blank. Bear market and
bull market? No.
Yeah.
Bull
No. Yeah. Bull is good. Bear is bad. Man, I'm way out of practice. But yeah, we see this sort of cyclical thing, and on top of that, when you do have some control over it, like some policies make a difference. What we tend to see is like these things are very delayed. It takes a long time for a stimulus to make a difference.
Right.
And we see a lot of presidents or senators or whatever try to take credit for if things are good, it was their policies, their actions, and if it was bad, that's the previous administration.
Right, and I think, politicians can really use the economy to get themselves elected, because people often vote with how they're feeling and how they're doing and with their wallets, right? So if the economy's good, then they're going to assume that, well, my politician's doing his job or I have my job,
Right, exactly.
And so when that changes, so politicians, I think, even more are realizing that people feel that way, and so they can use that as leverage. And I think we've really seen that in the Trump administration. That's part of what he ran on his platform in 2016. He wanted to be like, I'm going to change. I'm going to make the economy great. Like, I am going to use this. And whether he did or not, I think is a valid question. But the economy was great in the first few years of the presidency. But then depending on who you ask, it's like, oh, that was obviously this Trump's work, and then it's like other people are like, well, now it's just the rest of Obama's, because everything's delayed.
Right, and people were predicting a crash anyway.
Right.
And I think you're right. Trump definitely ran on that, like, oh, this isn't working for the middle class family, like the soul of America is being lost, all this stuff. But I think even if you flip to the Democratic debates prior to coronavirus, there was a ton of talk about how bad it was for like single moms, and every Democrat candidate wants to paint themselves as like, I come from a poor family. I know what it's like to struggle. I know you're struggling. I'm going to fight for you. I think both sides do this. So when they're actually in power, we see them saying, okay, I'm in power. The economy's doing well. We're getting stuff done. And then the other side is going to be like, the economy's horrible. This leadership is bad. So that's definitely got to contribute to this divide we see, where Republicans are much more likely to rate it as good, because I'm sure, President Trump has expressed a lot of optimism from day one, like warranted or not. He's been saying, oh, it's going to magically go away. We're going to try to keep things open. It's going to rock. The economy's going to take off like a rocket ship once we get back.
Right.
And people are obviously going to be influenced by that.
Right, because if you're prone to listen to Trump and agree with what he says, you're going to be like, well, yeah, obviously that's what's going to happen. And then if you're the opposite, you're going to be like, well, it's obviously not going to do that because he said it.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And it's one of the questions, like, I don't know how to fix it, except that people have to realize that politicians aren't economists and that they might have certain solutions, and then I think you can agree or disagree on those solutions. But do your research and look at to what the actual economy is doing,
Right.
as opposed to just filtering or just taking your politician's word at face value.
Yeah.
I think that makes a big difference.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So how can we be more objective about like how we view the economy? Is it as simple as just looking at GDP and looking at unemployment? Like, I'm not actually sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a good answer to that either, right?
Yeah.
But I think for me, something that has been eye-opening is whenever I look at an issue and when I think about the economy or when I read articles like 538's article, I think, okay, what am I prone to think, and what are these articles that I'm reading prone to think, right? And so assessing, okay, where is this coming from? What's the worldview of this person? And then being able to distinguish that from the truth. And I think that's a lot of what this podcast is about, is like looking at all different sides and figuring out what lies in between.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think this is another one with the economy that like sort of time will tell, like hindsight, it's going to sort of reveal, okay, were things that bad? Were things this good? Yeah. I mean, for a while there, I was not sure if we were going to hit like Great Depression levels.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. I still don't know like how we can recover from it in the sense of like, how are we paying for all this payroll protection program? I mean, that's been so much money. The stimulus checks that went out, huge amounts of money.
Right. It sounds like there may be more coming too. So
yeah, and the government makes its money off of taxes, which is dependent on like GDP, because they get a percentage of that. If that's contracting,
right. If people aren't working,
more.
They're not getting as much in taxes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how it shakes out. I mean, the government has always been like, oh, we have money for this, we don't have money for that, whatever. Now it seems like, okay, we've got money for everything. So
right.
if we're somehow afloat after this, we have to figure out how is this happening?
Yeah. And this is going to be a point of contention leading up into the election. Like, this is going to be a topic people are talking about all the time, and constantly looking at, people on both sides of the aisle are going to be saying, my policies are going to do this better. And I think just thinking about these things critically and not taking them at their face value, and looking at all sides is really going to be helpful throughout the next 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you have anything else to say about the economy and what we're feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've come up with some good sort of ideas about what might be causing this divide, but yeah, it's definitely, anytime you're seeing issues that are like, okay, one side feels exactly one way, one side feels the other, that's a good indication you need to do your own digging and figure out what's going on. And yeah, it's definitely a rough economy, that's for sure. I don't know. I mean, what were the Republicans calling it? They were calling it fairly good or very good.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of, because they don't want to call it poor.
Yeah. So I don't know how you could say that it's fairly good or very good, but I do see how you could think I'm expecting it to be fairly good. I think we're fine. Like, all things considered, we're getting better or something like that. But yeah, I think the phrasing is like really important too. I think people, when they fill out things, they don't read, they just click, and like you said, knee-jerk reactions. Everyone's got an opinion about everything, and
and you're kind of expected to have an opinion about everything, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So very interesting. I think this is a fun topic. I'm excited to see how it goes, and I definitely did not know that like it was such a stark contrast.
Right. And I think it's something I want to read more about. And you had one resource that you used in your classes that we wanted to mention. Do you want to pull that up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pull it up. So anytime we're talking about these huge, big things like the GDP and the unemployment rate, it's really important to like look at your sources. And
Right.
something we've always been referred to in school is, let me go ahead and share it. It's called FRED, which
Love the
I
name.
think
Love
stands.
it.
Yeah, I know. I think it's something. Yeah, Federal Reserve uh, economic data. I think is what it
Yeah.
is. Um, so Fred has stuff that's sourced straight from government numbers. It's a great tool for being able to look at GDP, unemployment. You can pick how many years you want to look at. There are ways that you can, let me go ahead and look at some of the big categories. You can adjust it for inflation or compare it to other things. So you have like consumer price index, which is like the pricing of things. Real gross domestic product accounts for inflation. There's so many different things you can look at. Exchange rate.
Yeah, I was on there for like 15 minutes and just like realized how much true knowledge there is on there, and I just want to do a deep dive and looking at all these different. It's all super user friendly and playable with the numbers and the dates and
Right.
just looking at everything. So
Yeah. So really important to look into this yourself. It's really complicated. Also, so like, don't get yourself in any trouble trying to draw
right,
conclusions. Like, it's easy to lie with statistics, and
right,
it is complicated. But there are, like we talked about, unemployment and GDP. They may not be perfect, all the way perfect, but they are good representations of, okay, this is definitely a crash, or this is boom, stuff like that.
right.
So that's really important to remember. So I want to give a shout out to Fred. I also, we're doing a recommendation for each week, and I might jump into that if you don't have anything else to say,
Yeah, go
Jared.
for it. You can do the recommendation and then tease what we're going to talk about next week.
Let's do it. All right, so we've talked about 538. My recommendation for this week is 538 as a whole, but in particular, they just released their 2020 election forecast. I watched the heck out of this thing in 2016.
Oh yeah.
And I just wanted to say a few words about 538 and the stuff they do. They are a subset of ABC, which is a subset of Disney. So make sure that you understand it's not just its own independent little thing. They have a lot of resources, a lot of connections. They're literally owned by Disney via ABC. So that's important
Everything's
to remember.
owned by Disney, right? So
I know. They do a really interesting job of making predictions using statistics and using simulations in really creative ways that I think give a really good, accurate picture for what it means to make predictions. Sometimes I think it's easy for different news sites or different partisan sources to say, oh, this is my prediction. And a lot of times you're like, is that really your prediction? Or are you trying to like rile up your base? Are you trying to paint a picture that fits your narrative? I don't know all the behind the scenes at 538. I don't know, but I tend to think that they strive for accuracy.
well, and 538 is cool because they take a lot of, they're an aggregate source, right? So they're not doing a lot of
Exactly.
reporting. They're looking at all these different polls and they're combining them together. And so
Right.
that gives them a really good, more overview sense than just one or two polls. And they're a little more on the conservative side, not politically, but like conservative in their judgments. As you can see, a lot of places are reporting higher numbers for Biden than 28 or than 72%.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, and so I think they're a really good source, and this is a really cool tool because you can play around with the graphs and look at the numbers, and it's interactive, and yeah,
right,
super cool.
Yeah, super good. I think one of the creative things that 538 does, let me see if I go back, is they sort of have they rate their pollsters. So like they'll look at, okay, this poll has been historically terrible. So even though it came out today, let me see if I can find like a little picture of how they do it. So here's kind of, this is for the popularity, but they'll say, oh, YouGov, we're
Right.
giving it a grade B based on how successful it's been in the past. So when they factor that in to their overall model, I'm sure there's a lot of magic behind it or whatever, they will note things with a higher rating of success in the past as a little bit more heavy. You can see the weight there.
You can see the weight, the samples size. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
it's pretty cool. They're not just trying to base it off their opinion. They're trying to say, okay, based on each state's polls, if someone is leading by this much in the polls, historically they should win 60% of the time. We run a simulation 40,000 times and we figure out how often Biden or Trump's going to win. So
Right.
I love watching it. I love if new big polls come out, it's fun to see if the odds go up or down, if there's a big bombshell, someone puts their
After
foot in the
debate,
mouth.
go on there. Yeah.
Really interesting. I think it's also important to realize, I know a lot of people are really skeptical of the polls because of what happened in 2016, where some sites were giving Hillary Clinton like 99% odds.
Right.
I think 538 was a little bit lower than that, but I think it's important to remember, people have a tendency to throw the whole thing out the window. I mean,
Right.
but I don't think, as a math major, like, it's important to realize what a statistic or a probability means. Like,
Right.
just because something is 95% likely does not mean that it's 100% likely. Like, there's a difference in that you can still have something be 95% likely, and then sometimes the 5% thing happens. Like,
Right.
you can go back and argue, okay, well, maybe our percentages were wrong, but every now and then, like if you're a poker player, every now and then the card you need comes out. And that's the way percentages work. It doesn't mean that the model was wrong or whatever, but I will say in hindsight, there probably needs to be a more critical review about some of the polls. But it's important to realize all polls are not a wash because the 10% likely thing happened, right? Like,
Right.
if something that was 90% likely to happen happened every time, we wouldn't call that 90%. Like, sometimes it has to go the other way. So all of that to say, I love this 538 tracker. I think it's really visually exciting. It's really cool to see all the toss-ups and where am I? Oh, I went too far. But
As a fun alt note, I was just talking to a friend, and she had asked like what I thought the percentages that Trump was going to win, and I was just like, somewhere around like I think it's like 30-ish%, and then the next day this came out, and I was like, vindication.
yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. So it's also a long way out, the election, and that's something.
Lot can change.
Yeah, it's something Nate Silver, who runs 538, has mentioned. Like, a lot of polls change between now and then, but
we haven't had debates yet. That can make a big difference. We don't know what the economy is going to look like.
Right.
COVID. There's so much this year. So
yes, yeah, things start to get pretty crazy in the last couple of months. We're gonna, like you said, debates, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, and since Kamala Harris has been announced this week, that might also have some effect on the polls, but we will probably see that into next week and how if at all it changed the way Biden was polled. So which is a great segue to next week's topic on Kamala Harris.
Yeah, so we want to take so that's kind of another big news thing that happened this week, and it's kind of eaten up the news cycle. But we wanted to do kind of a deeper dive into who she is and kind of what her party affiliation is. So you want to explain that a little bit? Because this is, we're really excited about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as Kamala Harris was announced, the race was on for, I think, the left and the right. We had such, I thought, bizarre reactions. So first off, I noticed right away, you see Fox News here as well, Tucker, Donald Trump, all of your right-wing sort of political commentators immediately start slamming Kamala Harris as the most liberal senator you'll ever meet. She's a radical. She believes in all of these crazy things, and there's clips of her saying all this radical stuff or whatever. And one thing that keeps getting touted is this site called GovTrack, which I should have. Where did you find that earlier?
I just had searched her name in the search bar up in the upper right.
Kamala Harris GovTrack. Like this.
Yeah, there she is.
And how did you? Oh, it's like right down here.
Right down there.
Yeah. So here, GovTrack has her. Where is she?
Right below you.
The triangle.
So yeah, way far on the left, like fourth most as of right now.
Yeah. So Republicans were all over that, and I'm definitely interested to see kind of the ideology behind that, why she's slated this way. Because on the other hand, the New York Times was calling her a pragmatic moderate. There was a lot of other mainstream media that was saying she's a moderate. And then you have sort of the more progressive wing of the Democrat Party, sort of your Bernie Sanders, Justice Democrat like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who would never view Kamala as a progressive radical at all. Like, I know a lot of the Bernie supporters outright reject Kamala Harris because of her past with marijuana,
Right.
criminalization of marijuana. She's voted for a lot of more international interventionism. And yeah, there's this sort of weird rejection from the far left that she's not progressive enough. And then you have the right wing trying to say she's super progressive. So I was thinking that this would be a great discussion for next week, as it sort of fits exactly what we're looking for in terms of let's take an idea or an issue that is it's a hot topic. You have one side saying one thing and one side saying the other. Clearly, there's a big political narrative here at play. Both sides are trying to spin it the way they want to spin it. So it's easy to sit down and be like, oh, the people I like think this one way.
Right.
So that must be the case. But instead, let's sit down. Let's look at Kamala Harris's policies.
This is someone who's super in the spotlight, like has been even more so since last year when she's announced her presidential campaign. And these debates, like she was looking like she was primed to take the presidency for a while.
Right.
So I think we have some really good resources on that.
So absolutely. Next week, we're going to examine how moderate or how progressive is Kamala Harris. I don't think we're ever going to be able to nail her down exactly,
right.
But I think it's a really, really interesting idea to figure out, okay, how much of this is hype? What are her historical beliefs from both sides? And we'll try to look at multiple interpretations, multiple sources, come up with a few possible answers as to where she actually is. But I'm really looking forward to talking about that. This woman could be the vice president come November and potentially the president after that. So
yeah, we don't know. So it's wide open.
So let's learn a little bit more about her and try to see through the noise on this. That's the whole idea.
Yep.
All right. Any last words, Jared?
In that case, I don't think so. We've got our recommendation. Thanks for sitting here and listening to us talk about things we don't know about very much. No. I love just having these conversations and getting to do deeper dives on topics. So I'm excited for next week.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop my screen share. Yeah, excited for next week. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. It's been fun. Hope you learned a little bit. I definitely learned a lot.
Yeah,
We'll keep learning together. Thanks so much, guys.
All right,
see you next week.
Thank you, guys.